Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Virgin Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Virgin Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Peter Fiske has packed a lot into his career. From being a rare successful academic to entrepreneur crossover to his current role as head of NAWI, the National Alliance for Water Innovation, he's just someone who loves building stuff. And he's done a lot, from building and selling PAX Water Technologies to setting up the infrastructure for the radically improved coordination of US research into water technology. He's also one of the most energetic people I know, game, recognized game, and one of the best communicators. Please enjoy my really fun conversation with Peter Fiske. Peter, welcome. How delightful to see you as ever.
Thank you, Tom. It is great to be here.
It's really excellent. So you've had one of the more interesting careers. One of the things I really like about The Fundamental Molecule is that we've had some really interesting people with some really interesting careers, but you've covered some ground with a capital G. Can you just walk us through your initial path into the water world? Just give us that arc first, and then we're going to be able to jump into a whole bunch of different things, but give us that arc first.
Well, first, Tom, careers make sense, but only in the rearview mirror.
Retrospect.
When you're going along, you sort of have these moments of like real uncertainty, and then some opportunity appears and it works out, et cetera. And I think that's not uncommon for people coming into the water space, from coming from the outside. Some train and have identified it, back from the beginning of their education, that's where they want to go. And some people fall into it. And I was certainly the latter category. A little bit about my background. So I'm a PhD trained scientist and a geologist. So technical by background, but not specifically watery in any respect. And had been pursuing a sort of typical research career that sort of went off the rails when I discovered that really I wasn't that good at it. And I also had these other things in kind of my portfolio of stuff I like to do and enjoy doing well that weren't really necessary for a research career. And that actually had me fall into an entrepreneurial career that started when I was still a scientist at Lawrence Livermore Lab and doing an evening MBA program. Even though I got my PhD, I went back a few years later and did an evening MBA program, which was very nourishing, but it left me very agitated about what can a technical person do in some of the broader worlds beyond just making new technology. That begat my first startup, which was an optics manufacturing technology that we commercialized out of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But in 2007, for various reasons, including the fact that I was dog tired and, kind of ready to have a break from my co-founders and everybody else, I basically began to look around, and there was this very interesting company in the San Francisco Bay Area, San Rafael, California. And they had a really interesting approach to fluid mechanical design using biomimicry. The idea is that, nature has an unlimited R&D budget and a very long product development cycle. And so you can look to nature and natural forms for insights to do things very efficiently, like, for example, move water. And they developed a technology, a very remarkable compact technology for mixing, literally mixing water. And you think, like, water's water. Why would you mix water? Well, there are places in our water systems where mixing actually becomes a critical problem. When we apply chemicals into treat water, making sure those chemicals get blended efficiently, that's a mixing problem. And even after the water is finished, Tom, we send it out in these pipelines all across town to these big water tanks. And the water, this beautiful, fresh drinking water, sits there and it gets warm, and that warm water floats to the top. And if you don't mix it, you end up with this big slug of warm water stuck in a tank. And that's how water quality can really degrade. So we came up with a very interesting approach for improving water quality, and that is simply to mix it. Radical, huh? So we began to sell these things called PAX mixers, this little tripod device with a funny looking impeller at the top. And it was so funny and interesting, actually, Tom, that the impeller, which we named the Lily impeller, was actually featured in the New York Museum of Modern Art in an exhibit on biomimicry. And because it was sort of a very unusual shape and looked very organic in a way, but in fact, it just moves a lot of water, which was the key technology. There were other mixers in the market that were big and galumphing and used 2 horsepower, 5 horsepower. You needed a crane. And then you had our little mixer. In fact, one of the problems was the mixer was so efficient and so small that I spent most of my time convincing my clients that the thing actually worked. And that's actually where the science came in. So one piece of advice in entrepreneurs in the water sector is that bring data. If you don't have data, basically you just have an opinion. And similarly, consulting engineers, if they don't have data, then they're basically a consulting engineer with an opinion. And so we found that the way to frame technical performance was really important. So we began to publish articles in popular trade magazines, OpsFlow, Water and Waste Digest, but we would put graphs and we would show and introduce concepts like the blending time, et cetera. And really the industry they'd sold mixers, but they never talked about the performance of mixers. So that is how we overcame that barrier. And then people loved our mixer because it was so small and easy to install. It didn't involve a crane and all this sorts of things. So we began to sell these mixers around the United States and then outside the United States. And so this little company, PAX Water, started growing. And then we realized that once you mix water out in the distribution system, what we call finished water, water's never really finished because what happens is the chemical disinfectants in the water can erode, they can degrade with time. And so you can actually use a water storage tank with a mixer as a little treatment plant. You can have the water that comes in has a certain quality, and then you can add just the right of adjustment so that the water in it, tune it in, just little dials. And you end up with this beautiful drinking water that leaves the tank and goes out into the community. So that ended up being a really, really nice utilization of an asset, an expensive asset like a water tank, and making that asset more valuable to a municipality. And that was another sort of clue, is that in fact, water utilities are very asset rich and asset dense, but not necessarily very value rich and value dense. So I find some of the most compelling opportunities for value creation in the water sector is utilizing existing infrastructure in new ways. And not necessarily, I love building new things. And as you know, Tom, I'm now running this major program called NAWI, the National Alliance for Water Innovation. We could talk about that later.
Oh, we will.
But in fact, a lot of stuff can be done with the stuff we have. And I find also for you talking to a manager of a municipal system or a plant manager at a factory, and you're like, I can get a lot of better stuff with all the stuff you have. People get really excited.
Really interesting. There are tons to unpack. I want to take you back actually to the first leap to start with, which is one of the things that we run into with a reasonable frequency is people who have built a technology out of a PhD program and they want to make it a real thing in the real world. But they're about to run into a very difficult sticky patch, which is that the thing you get rewarded for in a PhD program is not what you get rewarded for in the real world. And there's actually a very small slice of people within academia that have kind of the full package, all of the elements that you need in order to be able to make a PhD project a reality. So obviously, there's the capability of what's in the research and what's on the piece of paper, but then there's also the entrepreneurial facet. How you personify these, I think, in terms of people who have come out from academia into the entrepreneurial world, probably better than anyone. Part of that, I think, is luck.
Yeah.
Is that these are personal characteristics that you were born with. But how do you reflect on that? Do you advise people who are making this similar leap to?
I do. In fact, as you know, you and I are friends partly because we both share a real love and concern for these people who are making this journey. And so for starters, I'd say, Tom, the first thing I think of when I think of the whole issue of entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurship is first and foremost a personal choice and a personal and a career choice. Just as for me, there was a personal choice for me to leave a lackluster but decently satisfying research career and step into the entrepreneurial world. And there were personal reasons for me why that became more attractive. And so I first of all start with the idea that actually PhDs can be outstanding entrepreneurs.
Oh, of course.
Because they, for starters, are used to working extremely hard, are enormously resilient and resource efficient. I mean, nothing like, how long can I survive on this like Costco box of ramen? It's amazing. So they're very good at that. The problem that PhDs have is, as you said, the culture of the PhD in academia do not align necessarily with what we need in terms of change agency. For starters, the reward mechanisms for academia involve publications and various things, but they also involve what we call novelty. So, for example, in the academic world, you do something that is interesting, whether or not it is useful. And in the business world, you do something that is useful, whether or not it is interesting. And you can't get rewarded in the academic world for doing useful but not interesting, especially if it's not interesting to the small group of deranged colleagues that you have or happen to be, interested in that same sub discipline. So I think that that's another thing, is that practicality of what people are doing. Academia also encourages novelty for the sake of novelty, because that's how you get published. Is you don't get published saying, hey, this also works. Like, that invention that she had over there, it works. That's not a publication. However, in selling and developing value for clients, that sort of activity of, yes, it works, and here's how well it works, and here's how you use it effectively, is enormously valuable to clients. And so the other key ingredient I find, Tom, you express this idea of, like, there are these sort of Venn diagram of some qualities of the scientist and then some qualities to the entrepreneur. I'd say one of the key things that both inhabit but don't realize is empathy. Empathy for your customers, and truly hoping that what you have for them makes their life better. And scientists get into science for that reason, right? They want to make the world better in a broad sense. And they believe their theory of change is, if I invent new stuff and I publish about new stuff, it'll magically kind of riffle into the economy and make the world better. And that's why I'm a scientist. And a business person sits there and says, there are people out there, good men and women out there, working super hard with tools that suck. And we can make better tools for them. And not only will they be happier, but they'll be more successful, and we'll get the benefits of a better world. Same goal, but different perspectives. And so when I coach early career entrepreneurs, as I do, as you know, Tom, I often am talking to people as they're just venturing out. I make the following points in the pluses and minuses category. On the plus side, your chance of getting a grant these days and getting funded by a venture capitalist are kind of similar. So, it's a hard world either way, academic and sort of research world versus, kind of a startup. But the thing is, if you are excited about helping people in the concrete, as opposed to your excitement is on ideas and abstraction, that begins to, tell you where you should maybe apply your attentions. I am also a big believer on the two desert theory of life. I think you can remain in academia or remain as a researcher for many years before you have built up enough of a body of evidence that your idea can make money, can make significant money. And when I say significant money, we often think, the academic world, we really don't teach our PhDs some of the basics of business, of how profitable does a business need to be. A business has to be really offer tremendous value, especially as a small business, because so many other things about a small business are inefficient. You've got to have a catastrophically valuable value proposition, even if it's small. Big enough that you can live off of it, like a big enough sandwich, but small enough that you can really define the problem and own that small space.
Absolutely. Do you ever feel like, because you teach at the Haas Business School, you've obviously been a participant in an MBA yourself. Do you ever think that PhD programs should say, look, if you really are thinking about like commercializing something, then we should be offering, not necessarily a full MBA program, but at least a demystification of the startup process?
Yeah. I thought about this for a long time. Like, the joke I have is that, like, I don't know if you knew this, but McKinsey Management Consulting, they're a big international consulting firm, et cetera. From time to time, especially when the market is strong and they need to hire lots of cannon fodder, they actually go to the PhD programs. They begin to recruit PhDs. And one of the things, I talked to one of the senior recruiters for North America, and she told me that, we get these PhDs from these top schools, and then we take them down to Florida for a week-long MBA. We teach them everything they need to know about the MBA in 1 week.
To go and advise multinationals on pricing.
And I'm like, that's great. And she said, because they're very smart and they know you can throw a lot of material at them and they go really quickly. And so I chuckled about that. I thought, a week-long MBA. Wouldn't it be fun to take a bunch of MBAs and give them a week-long PhD?
Oh my God.
On Monday, you will read 60,000 pages of technical stuff. So the thing that I think is interesting about PhDs is that they are kind of resilient. They are used to learning quickly and on their own, but they miss two things. One is They don't understand the basics about business. And yes, Tom, I think that like a week-long intensive could teach anybody some really critical value concepts for being effective in the business. Well, frankly, and even being effective in the university world, because frankly, it's all a business to some extent.
It is, exactly. Once you see the product mindset, it's everywhere. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. But the other thing is, I think that PhDs often, the missing issue is not empathy or anything like this. It's sort of like the velocity, the willing to move fast. Because, actually, if you think about it, Tom, successful entrepreneurs are not risk takers. Okay? Successful entrepreneurs are not risk takers. Successful entrepreneurs analyze an environment, really study it, really discern what the factors and forces are, and then they wait. They wait for that opportunity, the confluence of things to come into their field of view, like the lion in the bush, waiting all afternoon, waiting for that big, fat, lame wildebeest to come wandering right past the bush. And I think the difference is entrepreneurs have a sort of velocity urge that they're going to explode out of the bush and go after that thing. And academics are often taught, sort of temperamentally, are taught to be much more cautious. And they'll say, well, that's a sizable wildebeest. It certainly fits my criteria for wildebeest. And so I think that that's one of the things I find even in myself is that sometimes the willingness to explode out with velocity and make a big change, which is what I had to do when I left, Lawrence Livermore Lab to start my first venture. I had to kind of leave behind a whole bunch of stuff and very quickly pivot to that world.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go next. Just before we do, it's like we were revisiting some slides the other day, and we've had this thing for a while called the Einstein theory of startup velocity/speed, which is, the old Einsteinisms. If you presented with a problem, you would spend 90% of the time on the problem and 10% of the time on the solution, right? You've got to really think about the set before you decide exactly what you're going to do. Whereas the entrepreneurial approach often is actually not velocity, it's speed. It's like, just do anything really fast and then we'll see where we end up. Whereas actually, if you consider velocity, which always has a vector, like if you've taken some time to really think about which way you're going, you'll end up much closer to where you want to be rather than the people who went at speed, who were like further along and further away than where you want to. And the gap between those is the value gap. It's such an interesting heuristic.
Again, I think that apropos of like value and speed, or velocity versus speed, academics can remain in academia and begin to test the value proposition of their ideas. And there are ways to do that. For example, you can consult as an academic. A number of startups I've seen actually started with a PI or somebody consulting or doing coding on the side or building something on the side. And universities have a structure of giving people permission to have that side activity. And so to some extent, you can really spend a little time testing the hypothesis and making sure that you can get revenue. Because after all, it is your life and you've got to make sure you're gainfully employed and make sure that this idea has merit. And that sometimes, especially in water, can take time simply because we know the decision-making process in many sectors in the whole water industry takes a little more time because people are risk averse, because they've got regulatory frameworks, and new stuff isn't always obvious to people who've been doing it the same way for the longest time.
Yeah. I just often wonder about that, though. Maybe I'm becoming increasingly kind of like dogmatic about this, and I don't know whether I'm like overshooting. It definitely does take time, but it's always struck me that enterprise software sales often take 18 months. We're not alone. There's some pretty sticky decision-making in industries across, but obviously, the way in which we sort of position this for entrepreneurs in water is you just have to understand how long it is likely to take, and then you have to plan and predicate your business on the basis of that rather than think that you're going to change it. You can do things to influence it.
I'm sorry to keep us on this point a little bit, but then
That's
again,
great.
One of the key issues is that often for the water sector, we need to genuinely demonstrate something at a scale or in a context that really looks like it's the environment this thing is actually going to operate. That's kind of one of my roles as executive director of NAWI, is that we are a funding organization. We are seeking to advance the frontier of performance of advanced water treatment like desalination and water reuse, et cetera. And so we kind of occupy a realm between the academic world and the industry world. And there is actually government funding available when somebody is making that journey or wants to test that journey. The government, when they fund research and development, they too are very concerned about commercialization, because it doesn't do anybody any good if you have an invention that is duly published in some obscure journal and sits there without being turned into practice. And so government, there are a number of funding sources that allow people in academia or somebody with an idea to test it and pilot it. And then you can get support for that rather than trying to figure out how to fund it all yourself.
I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but I'm just trying to picture Peter coming out of being the academic, moving into the startup world. What was your first sale like? And what did you learn from it?
I know our first sale, $4,000. It was for the optics manufacturing technology, but we had identified a way of polishing extremely hard materials. In this case, a material called silicon carbide, nearly as hard as diamond. But one of the things that silicon carbide's great at is it makes an extremely good mirror because it's so strong and tough. You can make it very lightweight. So if you're making a mirror, for example, for a predator or for a drone or something, and you need to have a little camera, you can have these very lightweight mirrors. And we knew the material was practically impossible to polish. And our first check was for $4,000 to do a demonstration. We charged a customer, said, we'll polish your material for $4,000. And we polished that silicon carbide object. We sent it back to them. And I got my check. I still have that picture. I was holding our first check.
What did it take for you to get as good as you became? Because one of the things I think that always strikes me when I'm talking to you is that, I mean, you've already said that you bring data is like a big part of obviously the sales process. You've got to be able to demonstrate that it works. But in terms of like somebody who has really come up the kind of the commercial curve and has a lot to pass on to other people in that respect, I suppose what I'm trying to drive at is like, how has your thinking progressed around the nature of sales as an early stage? And how do you reflect on what you learned and when as you went through that process?
Yeah. Okay. So for starters, you asked an earlier question that I didn't want to leave unanswered. And that's how did I feel? And like, what was my concern and excitement at that first $4,000 check? I think there's a funny thing before you kind of get into the selling process, you're kind of afraid to ask for money. You're kind of like, well, this is so great. I'll do it for free. And, if you can do it for free, that's great. But one of the problems about doing stuff for free is that's probably the value that your customer is placing on the thing that you're doing for them. You've essentially discounted it to zero. And so for me, part of why we had to charge that $4,000 is we really needed the money. So there was an urgency for me to do something that I was uncomfortable with. And that is to say, I really want to show you how well this polishing process works. I really would love to do that, but I can't do that without some what's called NRE, non-recurring engineering fees, because I have to set up tooling, et cetera. And you know what they said? Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Great.
Can you take a pro card?
Relief.
And then I was like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. And then you're like, should I have asked for $8,000?
Yes, damn it. Yeah, that's the second thing that comes running into the mind. Exactly.
And so I think that one of the things that's important for entrepreneurs, and especially technology entrepreneurs, I think, again, one of the sort of pathological aspects of the academic worldview is like, if we just all publish everything and make it free,
Information.
then the world will be a better place. Unfortunately, what we've done is we've essentially made a system in which nobody has traction on anything. So nobody can get any traction and grip and hold on to something. So everything slips away. And so I try, when I talk to early stage entrepreneurs, I try to really bore in, not on like what the cost of we've got a new electrode and it's, it can be so cheap. I said, don't tell me how much it costs to make. Tell me how much value it creates for this customer. Tell me just how acutely this problem is being considered by the customer and her management and her people. Like, first of all, who is this customer? When people say, I want to sell products in the water industry is not a customer. Customers are people who have jobs to do, and those jobs are hard. And some of those things that they're dealing with are genuinely freaking them out. I do not know how we're going to achieve compliance in the next quarter because we've already blown past our past 3 quarters of THM levels in our distribution system. And I am awake at nights knowing I'm going to have a violation. That's pain. And I don't want to inflict pain on people, but I certainly want to find customers who are in acute pain. You know why? Because I'm an empathetic person and I want to help people relieve their pain. And I want to find opportunities for catastrophic relief of pain, not just marginal. That'd be nice. Yeah, it'd be nicer to take a little less time, blah, blah, blah. No, I want people like, oh, thank God. How soon can we start this?
So how does that overlap? How does that overlap with your work at the moment now? And we need to get into the founding story and exactly kind of what it is. But how does that overlap, that need for people to be working on things that are just, oh dear, this is so bad?
it's a great point that you raised, because again, I think one of the biggest flaws, I think, in our kind of ecosystem of academics way over here and industry and people over here, is that the academics genuinely don't understand and perceive the problems as viewed by the people over here. And that the problems are often not as complicated as people like to work, but the problems are still very intellectually interesting. And you just need to get them over here and get them talking to people. So one of the key things that NAWI has done is NAWI is a 5-year program, now renewed for a second 5 years, funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. And we are focusing on advancing water treatment and also the better optimization of water systems at every scale. At the scale of a unit process like reverse osmosis membranes, at the scale of a treatment train like a whole reverse osmosis plant, at the scale of a regional water system like Phoenix, where I am today, where they are running out of water and they have pain. And so as now we bring these academics, we drag them literally over to sit for a day and a half. And I just had one of these sessions with some of the leaders in the consulting engineering community and some of the leading experts in the academic community, as well as some of the project developers. These are the people who try to finance water projects. We had all three of them together for a day and a half and worked through what are the real challenges to inland brackish desalination. We've got a lot of brackish groundwater across the United States, 900 years of water supply in these brackish groundwater aquifers, and we aren't using any of it. Why? And so that was the issues. And it's, if you're an academic, your theory of change is about invention. Like, oh, why are we using it? Because we don't have the right technology, or that maybe the technology needs to be cheaper. And that's probably true to an extent. But why is it not happening now? Well, there are other factors, including nobody's organized this in a way that I, as a municipal manager, can utilize this tool. I know the tool exists, but not in a form that I can utilize. And that's every bit innovation as the invention that the academics do.
Just to carry that on just a second, because the brackish water desalination is such a big deal. Are you starting to see the crystallization or the kind of coalescence of the ideas about what you think the future of that is going to be? Can you walk us through it? Or just what you think at the moment? We're not going to hold you to it. We won't be like, Peter, you said this was good.
Okay. Well, let me just tell you one anecdote. So now the NAWI 1.0 program has invested in teams. All of our teams are combinations of academic researchers, national lab scientists, and industry partners. So almost all of our projects, by nature, we force these people together to work. And as a result, we've been rolling through some inventions and demonstrating some stuff. And we now believe that in the United States, we could produce ag quality water from brackish groundwater for an all-in cost, including brine disposal, of under $850 per acre foot. Now, that number is expensive for ag traditionally if you're growing cotton or you're growing alfalfa. But when you're growing strawberries or keeping your nut trees alive in a drought, that number is extremely attractive. That is one example of the academic world can pose and work on innovations, but until you roll it up into a cost, like what will this cost me? It often, those innovations aren't clear to the water resource community. And so that's an example of what we need to do as scientists. We need to do a better job, not just of inventing what we invent, but also framing the value proposition and developing our innovations framed on the value propositions that matter most to this segment.
NAWI itself is funded by the DOE.
Yes.
Which is awesome. I remember when it was awarded and we knew it was going to come, and it was just so exciting that this kind of quantum of capital was going to be coming to support water.
That's right.
In essence, like, people in energy probably wouldn't have been as excited. Like, water has been so overlooked in favor of the kilowatt hour. The gallon has been so overlooked in favor of the kilowatt hour. I mean, I wonder whether we can just talk about a couple of the dynamics in this. The first question being, why isn't there a Department of Water, and should there be?
That question, Mr. Ferguson, that you just asked, is a question that the U.S. Department of Energy and other federal agencies are asking themselves now. So there's an interagency panel, a working group, and water in the United States is a little bit of a curious object because we have partitioned the authority and the legal structure and the oversight of water in very different ways. So, for example, if you're concerned about drinking water and drinking water quality, that's the EPA. However, if you put a boat on a body of water, that's Department of Commerce. If you look at water from space, that's NASA. If you're measuring the flow of a river or groundwater, that's the U.S. Geological Survey. And other countries have a little bit more consolidated view. So like other countries often will have a Department of Natural Resources, et cetera, and that some of the governance around water and water systems falls within that. Sometimes some governments have water governance within a public health and like more like an NIH kind of aspect of that. But so we're a little scattered, but that's okay. That's not our main problem. Our main problem is that we don't use water very well because a lot of the laws, I mean, here's the funny thing. We've got brains from the Pleistocene. We've got legal structure from the 19th century. We've got water technology from the 20th century, and we've got a 21st century climate. So we've got some problems. And the approach, and this is, where NAWI is not just about making desalination more efficient. NAWI is trying to create a space where these brilliant constituents can come together and ask, how does the 21st century water system need to be fundamentally different? We've enjoyed, thanks to our grandparents and great-grandparents, a marvelous, largely centralized set of infrastructure in Europe and in North America and in some other places, centralized infrastructure with big centralized treatment plants and lots of pipes under the roads and all that sort of stuff. And we are looking at cities like Bangalore that are exploding in growth, and there is no infrastructure, no 20th century infrastructure there to meet the families who are living in apartment buildings and living in houses in that ever expanding city. And we have to ask ourselves, maybe the energy sector, as much as we kind of look sometimes at envy that they get all the money, they're also a place of insight because the energy sector went through this same transition. In the 20th century, all of our energy generation was in large scale, largely combustion-based, centralized power plants with a big grid of wires dangling on poles. And today we still have that infrastructure, but we've supplemented with distributed energy generation in the form of wind and even solar panels. And some of that energy generation is all the way down to the level of an individual home. In fact, we can now buy products off the shelf that could make our homes energy neutral. We could buy a battery in a garage and panels on the roof, et cetera. Energy neutrality is reality today.
Take ourselves off the grid at Home Depot.
Water neutrality is every bit as conceivable, and it might actually be essential. It might actually be essential because if we want to densify our cities, especially our older cities, we want to replace 4-story buildings with 12-story buildings, but the sewer can only take 4 stories worth of load. So we need to make buildings more water efficient. We need to have unit processes in the building. Buildings need to have like kidneys that process and reuse some of that water and allow us to grow economically and affordably, but also to grow in ways that we lessen the impact on the natural ecosystems. And as you know, most of man's impact on the natural environment has been through the vehicle of water, how we pollute it, how we divert it, how we consume it, etc. And so I think that frame is really powerful. And that's, again, what NAWI is trying to do is not just innovate in the technology space, but also get us to the point where we can begin to see this vision and demonstrate it in a few places.
Where do you think we are in the journey towards kind of large-scale acceptance of this? Because there's tacit acceptance of the pathway here.
You mean just more distributed, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, what is the line of water delivery trucks driving up to Bangalore other than a tacit acceptance of reality? It's enforced. But we've just front page of the New York Times this weekend. We're recording on May the 22nd. Front page of the New York Times this weekend is Mexico City.
Mexico City.
They are out on June the 29th. And hopefully the rains will come and we'll be fine. And it'll be similar to kind of Cape Town. But in general, I suppose I'm asking about kind of mass market acceptance, but it could be up to and including the kind of the powers that be that you're much closer to than many other people in the water side of things. Do you think we're getting there in people actually understanding the degree of, as they might say in Frankfurt, shtuck that we find ourselves in? Where are we in that kind of trend of acceptance that actually we need to really stomp on the gas in, whether it's decentralization or just accepting that this is something that needs to happen yesterday because we're close to the line?
Well, so this gets back to my comment about we're unfortunately endowed with brains from the Pleistocene.
Yeah, I really like that 4 layers, by the way. It's great. Totally using that.
We don't have an innate capacity of that sort of forward plan. It's very hard for us as creatures to do. And so we got to, look, okay, that's fine.
We always underestimate it.
But we have done it. And so the first step is to say the future is already here, Tom. It's just not, uniformly distributed. So there are places right now where you're seeing the emergence of this new 21st century water system. And they had to do it because they faced an existential crisis. In Singapore, they literally did not have control of the only watershed that feeds their country. That belongs to Malaysia. And They love the Malaysians. Malaysians love them, but you just can't always count on that. And so that was an existential crisis. Australia, when they had a 12-year drought, which, by the way, we're going to see much, much more frequently, this sort of deep dives into drought and then deep reaches of excessive water. It's just going to be more and more amplitude in the next 100 years. You're going to see communities forced, okay? The first ones had to figure it out. And, God bless the Singaporeans for all the initiative and innovation that they showed, patience, resilience, all that sort of stuff. But we also see it in Southern California. Southern California has a network of brine lines, Tom. These are basically sewer pipes from 30, 40, 50 miles inland where you can put a desalting plant and then pour the brine in and it goes right out to the ocean. That was a piece of centralized infrastructure, and we can't repeat it. We can't dig new brine lines. But maybe we can have virtual brine lines where you have an aggregation of brine waste with trucks. They come into a cluster of facilities, and those facilities are designed to accept brine and squeeze out every last drop of water and leave behind just dry salts. And one of the other areas of research for NAWI is that water is the universal solvent, so it actually contains a lot of stuff, and we can actually beneficiate some of that stuff on the process of what we call brine valorization. And one of the most obvious things we can do is create the acids and bases out of those brines that we're using back in the water treatment plant anyway. So the water treatment plant could actually generate its own chemicals with just electricity and some of these technologies. And so, again, the Homo sapiens brain, when's the best time to dig a well? Before you have a drought, right? When's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. Okay. But the next best time is today.
Yes. It's great to hear what sounds like a good degree of optimism.
Optimism, yeah.
I've been thinking about an idea recently, and I don't know what you think of it. So sectors like product go through S curves. There is the initial adopters and then the explosion of commitment, and then, everything reaches to steady state. Like, where would you put water technology in the context of that S curve?
You mean some of this distributed technology?
Well,
or just water technology in general?
Water technology as a whole. I think about this in terms of kind of insurtech or fintech or enterprise SaaS or whatever. A lot of it has gone through the S curve, and it's just sort of like a mature operating industry with an ecosystem around it that's sort of funding, it's talent, it's all of this stuff. Well, where do you think we are on that in terms of water technology?
Our current centralized infrastructure, the concept of it is actually age old, right? It goes back to the first cities in Samaria and the places where we first were almost heretical, almost defying the gods by diverting a natural feature like a water into a canal and moving it around. So incredible Homo sapiens arrogance. Gotta love those guys. But that centralized kind of like let it flow downhill kind of thing, that actually defined where we put cities, Tom.
We're totally predicated on it.
So to some extent, I think your question of where is water in this kind of curve is not, water is a part of human civilization. So let's imagine a future, which I think is quite in our grasp, where even in almost every climate, maybe even in climates like Phoenix, the buildings themselves would recover 80, 90% of the water that's consumed in the building, meaning that the remaining 10% balance that needs to be made up is made up by the water that falls on the roof and the water that comes in the door in the form of groceries. Or if you need a little extra water, 300 gallons of water, your EV in the middle of the night rolls itself out and goes to the water bank and fills up its tank and then comes back and puts its snout into your house and fills up, the house, et cetera. But if we had a decoupling, so we've done this in energy, we can decouple where we build from the energy grid. And if we could decouple where we build from the water grid, we could on the one hand, we could overrun a whole bunch of land. And I'm not a big fan of paving paradise and putting up a parking lot. But at the same time, I think that because our water discharges historically have been the main means by which we have contaminated and challenged our natural ecosystem.
Yeah.
If we closed the loop and actually didn't have discharges and our buildings recovered that and the other waste, that 10% waste was consolidated to a point where it wasn't discharged back to the environment. It was transferred small and compact enough. It gets transported every Thursday. You pull out your bins, you pull out your garbage bin, you pull out your composting bin, you pull out your recycling bin, and you've got your box with that week's supply of solutes that the house generated. You could live anywhere. And if we could build a lot of them, when you build a lot of the same thing, they get very cheap. Another thing I don't like about the water sector today is we're still in this bespoke slide rules and blueprints world of everything has to be custom. we are seeing a super exciting emergence of mass design, facilitation, and manufacturing. I mean, and I think one of the reasons why reverse osmosis is such a powerful technology is not just that the membranes are great, but we developed very early on an extremely nifty package, a module with rolled up 40 square meters of membrane in a little tube. And those things slide together. A great modular design, way ahead of its time, by the way, but a great modular design enabling everybody to make and get economies of manufacturing because we're making the same thing over and over again. But the water sector has got a long way to go to develop that same manufacturing efficiencies. Our future is not going to be building custom plants. It's going to be making water washing machines, little modules that you plug together. Those will be appliances. That's where I think we're going.
Absolutely fascinating. I just want to take you back to something. Actually, I've loved this because we've gone into places that I really did not expect us to, but I want to take you back to the ruthlessly kind of practical side of things. So sort of back to your running of the business. So you sold PAX to UGSI, which has, since morphed into Clean Water One, which is under the direction of our investment committee member, David Stanton. How do you reflect on the process of actually selling your company? And how do you reflect on the role of private equity within the overall water technology and entrepreneurship stack? Do you see it developing? You may not have reflections on it at all, but as one of the people who have been through the process of having your company bought, and then that company was taken on by private equity at Bayer Capital, I thought you'd have reflections.
Not so much on the latter, because I think it deserves a more thoughtful data set than what I possessed of myself. But the former, the first part, one of the things I would say is that your company, as you're developing your company, you're thinking about your primary products and your primary customers. But you also need to think that the company itself is a product and that there are customers for that product, the company. And just as I said earlier, that the customers who are most likely to want to buy that product are the ones who are feeling pain. So what do I mean by pain? Well, let's imagine that you're a larger company and that you have a set of products in the marketplace. And this small startup has clearly got something better, cheaper. You can kind of move them aside, or you've got superior, kind of like selling power for a while, and you can kind of dominate the airwaves, et cetera. But then you start losing deals and you just get underbid. And then you find that CDM Smith is now speccing their product in two of the projects that you thought you had. That's pain. And so that's often the time when a company says, geez, it doesn't make sense for us to be fighting over this. Maybe we should be, collaborating. And that can sometimes be an acquisition. It can sometimes be a joint venture. It can sometimes be sort of things. We obviously want to maintain economic competitiveness and not collude into market fixing, all those things, because that's illegal. But it's often the case that you sit there and you come along, you've built your business, and there's this one piece that isn't missing, and then you see it over there. And you're like, oh, thank goodness. That's sometimes why a company might be acquired. Sometimes a new thesis is just so radical that a company is going to redefine the space. And this is kind of what you see in other sectors, is it redefines the space. And that the incumbents are like, well, I wouldn't do it that way. Or none of my customers would do it that way. Just wait and see.
Yeah.
And so those are the big ones. Those are the big wins. And I think that we've seen this in so many other sectors, Tom, as you know, so every other sector. So water has this time. I can't predict exactly what it's going to be. Maybe the idea that we don't have centralized systems. Maybe that we have enough intelligence and automation that we can rely on a fundamentally automated system. Maybe, I don't know. It's so exciting. It's hard to kind of wrap your brains around it. But I do know one thing, and that is that our climate is changing, that the principal delivery vehicle for those effects will be the water cycle, and that we have a lot of existing infrastructure already built. Much of it is going to be challenged by that.
Yeah. Which is a recipe for not having any choice. It's something that we have to do and we have to go through. There's no alternative, which is obviously as a fundamental driver, it's an exceptionally powerful one.
Yeah, the fundamental molecule.
I should put that on a t-shirt. In fact, we should put that on a t-shirt. I don't know why we haven't done that already. So final question that we ask all of our guests. What is the single most important piece of advice for future and aspiring water entrepreneurs?
I think the water industry is an unusually cordial and collaborative industry. And I think that as you choose to enter this industry with your idea, your new thing, seek ways of collaboration, seek ways of synergy like water, seek ways to be confluent with other partners. I think that you will find that you may worry, you might give up a little too much, or you might mortgage away a little too much. But I think that the good nature of serving this community also is, in terms of markets to serve. You could start a company and serve 16-year-old boys playing video games all day long. You could do that with your life. Or you could choose with your life to devote yourself to the foundational resource upon which our communities and our cities and our industries are built. At the end of my day, I think it's a pretty easy choice.
Couldn't agree more. Peter, it's always such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on The Fundamental Molecule.
No worries, Tom. Thank you so much, Marissa. Thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you today. And future self, I'm looking forward to seeing you. I hope you stay healthy.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye-bye, everybody.